Hi everyone, welcome. This is a Film Studies channel. We're going to be talking to you about all things related to the study of films. And the video today is going to be on the Auteur Theory. I should probably get this out of the way now. There are going to be lots of French words that I'm going to be saying in this video. And I don't speak French and my pronunciation of French isn't great. So I apologise in advance to anybody who does speak French and is watching this video. So the Auteur Theory is going to come up, if you're studying the Eduqas A-level film, it's going to come up on Component 1, Section A, the one on Hollywood comparison, and also on Component 2, Section D, on experimental film, so it bookends the two exams. Really, Auteur Theory, when we talk to fellow film fans about our favourite directors, or if we see a film poster that mentions the director in the trailer, or if we see things like box sets which are dedicated to a particular director, or even if we see seasons on at, say, the BFI, which are dedicated to a particular director, that's all basically partly in thanks to the Auteur Theory. Before we get into what the Auteur Theory is, I'm just going to say that the word theory is in there for a reason. It's not the only way to study films, it's just a way to study films. And there are lots and lots of people who disagree with the Auteur Theory as a way of discussing and studying films. We'll talk about one of those today. And it's just one of many critical approaches, and obviously you'll be using lots of critical approaches on the exam, like narrative and ideology. Auteur Theory is just one way that you can look at films, okay? It's just one of the many critical approaches. So where does it begin? Auteur Theory is widely credited as originating from a French writer and eventually film director, a guy called Francois Truffaut. He was at the time writing for a magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma, along with other famous film academics, critics, writers, André Bazin, and also another fellow film director, Jean-Luc Godard. And he wrote an essay called A Certain Tendency of French Cinema. He spends quite a lot of this essay just ripping into directors that he doesn't like. And the directors that he doesn't like, he refers to these directors as metteurs en scène, okay? And a metteur en scène is basically a director who's technically fine, you know, make okay films, nothing to kind of criticise them for in terms of the way they've been put together, but they're just a bit bland, a bit voiceless. There's no individual personality that stands out to the viewer as he watches them. And he said this belongs to a tradition of quality. These types of films, he said, they're all part of this tradition of quality that is common in French films. And he was not a big fan of tradition. In fact, he would later go on to become a director as part of the French New Wave. So you can see, you know, New Wave obviously doesn't sound very traditional, does it? And his biggest sort of bugbear was when these directors, these metteurs en scène, were taking novels or taking scripts that were written by another scriptwriter and just doing a very faithful adaptation of that source from page to screen. And he was saying, what's the point in that, really? If you want to just see a novel turn into the film, why don't you just read the novel? The novel's there already. The whole point of cinema is that we're bringing something new to it, and it's the director's job to do that. So if he didn't like those types of directors, these metteurs en scène, what did he like? And the answer is auteurs. He refers to them as auteurs. And auteur is the French word for author. And we obviously, when we think about that in English-speaking countries, the word author, we think about someone who writes novels. Generally speaking, writing a novel is a solitary practice. It's something that you do on your own. And if you look at a novel by, say, Fyodor Dostoevsky or something like that, it's very clear that they're the author of that novel. And there might be other people who might have helped them out along the way, but it's their novel. Okay, and that is what Truffaut felt the directors should do. They should have the same amount of creative control and the same amount of influence over a film as an author, a novelist does over a book. So along with having that sort of full creative control over the film, what an auteur needed to do, according to Truffaut, was they needed to show themselves up on the screen. They needed to expose themselves, their vulnerabilities, so not literally being on the screen, but in terms of their soul, if you like. So all of their fears, their anxieties, their hopes, their dreams, all of this should be laid bare on the screen for the audience to see. And in showing that to the audience, it would enable the audience to better understand their own fears and dreams and hopes and anxieties. Okay, and that for Truffaut was the ultimate mark of quality for a piece of art. And we'll get on to criticisms of auteur theory in a moment, but just to kind of say a couple of nice, kind words about Truffaut and Cahiers du Cinéma and the writers of that. Really, for them, they were amongst the first to really make the case that film could be or was an art form, and should be held in the same regard as great works of literature or amazing, works of art, paintings and stuff like that. If film is an art form, then filmmakers were therefore artists and they should be respected and treated as such, hence the auteur theory. And if it weren't for magazines like Cahiers du Cinéma, and it wasn't for people like Truffaut, etc., championing cinema as an art form, we probably wouldn't be studying it now in schools and sixth forms in universities. So Truffaut wrote A Certain Tendency of French Cinema, I think in 1953, it was published in 1954, something like that. Cut to just about 8 years later, and you've got Andrew Sarris, an American film critic, and he wrote an essay article called Notes on the Auteur Theory in 1962. And Sarris sort of said the auteur theory is great, but it's a little bit woolly. We need to firm it up. We need to give it a bit more of a shape. So what Sarris did, and this was his development to the auteur theory, was he said that directors had to do 3 things in order to be considered an auteur. Okay, and he sets it up as like circles. So you've got the outer circle, which is technical competence. That's the first thing they have to do. And then the second circle, which is distinguishable personality or recurring characteristics. And then the final one, to get to the bullseye in the center of it to be considered an auteur, is interior meaning. So let's talk about those 3. So technical competence, what Sarah said by that is that in order to be considered a great director, you had to be at least a good director. So you need to know how to work all the camera equipment, you need to know how to structure a film's narrative, tell stories, that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the first thing. If you can do that, then you can get considered eligible for the second one. And this is the one that a lot of people kind of think about when think about auteur theory. And he said they had to have a distinguishable personality, and basically that means that there needs to be recurring motifs or characteristics, things that the director keeps doing over a body of work. Okay, and this is what lots and lots of directors do then, and really since Sarris has said this, I think a lot of directors have purposely kind of gone for that in order to be considered auteurs, and you can see it in the 70s with that kind of American new Hollywood thing with like Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola and stuff. Also in the 90s and up to today. So films that are very easily recognizable as being made by that director is a really good example of this second characteristic. So if we look at one of the most obvious ones people point to would be something like Wes Anderson. So Wes Anderson, he always has that sort of central shot composition. He uses that kind of pastel color palette, I guess you would say, very deliberately constructed, almost a flat look to his films in terms of the aesthetic, but it's not just to do with the aesthetic, the look of the film or the feel of the film. It's also to do with things like directors might have particular themes they keep revisiting, or particular narrative structures, or particular character types. So obvious ones for that would be someone like Hitchcock, loves voyeurism, puts that in a lot of his films. In terms of his narratives, they quite often start in disequilibrium or have a very short equilibrium. In terms of characters, the cool blonde for one, also, the wrong man character, that kind of stuff. So these are all things that would be part of Hitchcock's distinguishable personality and make him eligible for that second circle. And the final and third circle in order to become an auteur, that last criteria, is what Sarris refers to as interior meaning. It's a little bit vague, I think, a little bit woolly what he means by this, but the phrase he uses is where the meaning of the film is created from the tension between the director's personality and the source material. So I think this is kind of a run-on from what Truffaut was saying, in that the director's personality should trump the source material, it should transcend that, and the film should be about the director as personality, as opposed to, doing a faithful adaptation of a script or a book. Okay, right, so the next addition to the auteur theory was a British film writer, critic, academic called Peter Wollen. He wrote a book in, I think it was 1969, called Signs and Meaning, or maybe Meaning and Signs. And in it, he sets out a league table of directors. Okay, so you got the sort of the lower rungs, and they're like okay, and then you've got the good ones, and you've got the really good ones, and then at the very, very top of this league table of directors, you've got what he refers to as the Pantheon, okay? And the Pantheon are, for him, the ultimate auteurs. And in that, you've got lots of familiar names. So you've got Orson Welles, who I believe is one of the Component 1 Section A. Lady Shanghai is in there. You've got Alfred Hitchcock. You've also got Charlie Chaplin, you've got John Ford, you've got Ernst Lubitsch, loads of directors, well not loads, probably about 12 or 13 or something like that. Okay, and what's interesting about Wolens' Pantheon is in it he really kind of sets out who the canon of the great directors and the great works are for film studies, and lots of kind of people from that point on would look at those and would say, like, you know, these are the great films, if you like, in the same way that, like, in English lit, you know, the canon would be full of people like, you know, Shakespeare, for example. Let's move on to criticisms of the auteur theory, and for that we're really going to be focusing on one film critic, and that is the legend Pauline Kael. Okay, so Pauline Kael, also an American film critic, she read Sarris's notes on auteur theory and she did not like it one bit. So what Pauline Kael did was she wrote a rebuttal article called Circles and Squares, in which she basically just like tears strips off Andrew Sarris, and it's a bit like sort of the film critic equivalent of a rap battle, and she just says, like, everything he says is idiotic. The first one, technical competence, she says that one is dumb, because she says that technical competence, and this I think she's a bit in agreement with Truffaut, and she's saying technical competence doesn't necessarily make for good films. In fact, it can make for quite bland films. So, you know, a filmmaker might make technically competent films, but there's no innovation there. And because there's no innovation, there's no uniqueness, there's no artistry, hence you cannot be considered an auteur, all right? Or a great director, or a maker of great films at least. So she said in order for film to kind of be considered an art form, you need to get people who are going to break the rules, and they're not going to do that if they're kind of following the technical competence thing of what directors should do. Second one, the distinguishable personality. The repeated characteristics across films. So this is a really good one. She says, you know, when did repetition become a good thing? Okay, so one of her quotes in it is something along the lines of, repetition without development is decline. The idea that if you keep doing the same thing and not developing, not moving forward, you're basically going downhill as a filmmaker. And she said, you know, it's the equivalent of praising a garment or a technical product like a phone for whatever because of the label that made it. Okay, so like, you know, if you've got a Calvin Klein suit, you know, saying this is a great suit because it's Calvin Klein, or if because you've got the latest Apple iPhone, you're saying it's a great phone because it's Apple. Okay, you're paying for the label in those instances. And she's saying doesn't necessarily make it great. She said when the film is good, we focus on the film. When the film is bad, because of the auteur theory, we focus on the person who makes it, and we say, well, it must be great because Alfred Hitchcock made it. Okay, and this is quite interesting because you know, and to be fair, this is one of the things about the auteur theory which I think is a little bit, but Truffaut in an interview said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing here, an unsuccessful film by an auteur is always more interesting, more worth consideration over, you know, a film by someone who's not an auteur, even great films maybe. So that's kind of interesting. And I do wonder if that's the case. So something like Vertigo, for example, when Vertigo came out, it didn't get very good reviews. There's a famous one in Variety, and I think the writer of this Variety review said something like, you know, Alfred Hitchcock here is repeating himself again, but this time in slow motion. The idea that he's doing something that he's done before, but just not as well, not as successfully. But because of, I think, the auteur theory, and because of books like that Hitchcock Truffaut one and stuff like that, lots of people kind of kept going back to Vertigo and giving it a second and a third and a fourth watch. Because, you know, it's Alfred Hitchcock, so it must be good, right? And now, you know, Vertigo is considered the greatest film of all time according to, you know, the Sight and Sound poll, and it is considered one of his masterpieces. Were it not for the auteur theory, I don't think people would be saying that about it. It probably would have been forgotten. You could make the case. I don't know. Maybe that's controversial, but there we go. And the third one, the interior meaning one, she says, you know, this again is ridiculous. Why would it be a good thing for a director to be in conflict or for there to be tension between the director and the source material? Surely the best film is going to be one where the director and the source material are working in harmony together to bring out the best of both. So that's her criticisms of Andrew Sarris. It's pretty savage. It's definitely worth a read. Circles and Squares. And then a couple of years later, not quite sure when, she wrote an essay about Citizen Kane called Raising Kane. Okay, and Citizen Kane is directed by Orson Welles, and lots of people say, again, before Vertigo toppled it off the Sight and Sound poll, Citizen Kane was considered the greatest film ever made, and people were saying the reason why it's so great is because Orson Welles had loads and loads of creative control. Okay, the studio just said, you go make the film, do what you want to do, and he made this film, and Orson Welles co-wrote it, stars in it, and directed it. But she's saying a lot of the things that people praise Citizen Kane for, the writing, the narrative structure of it, and the cinematography, the fact, Orson Welles does stuff where he shoots the ceiling, and there's all these, great bits of deep focus and stuff in there. Said a lot of that stuff that people are praising for and accrediting to Welles and saying this is why he's such a great filmmaker is actually due to other people who worked on the film. Joseph Mankiewicz co-wrote the script of Citizen Kane. Okay, so he's got to get credited for it. And Greg Toland, all that amazing, deep focus photography that people are loving in Citizen Kane, that's because of the cinematographer Greg Toland. So this is a big problem with the Auteur Theory, is that it doesn't acknowledge the significant contributions of all of the other people who worked in that film. And we can look at things like Hitchcock, you've got Bernard Herrmann, you've got Edith Head, with Blade Runner, you've got Vangelis, you've got Sid Mead, not to mention the actors in these films, James Stewart and, Harrison Ford, all these other people working on these films. Do they not have an influence on how the film turns out? And then the last one, and unfortunately I don't have sort of a person to credit with this one, although I'm sure lots of people have said it. But the problem with the Auteur Theory, and you can see this in Wolens Pantheon, and also you can see it in the essays written by Truffaut and Sarris, because they refer to the director as he throughout. And if you look at Wolens Pantheon, they're all men, and also they're all white as well. When we look at things like the Oscars, we're still seeing, this massive imbalance towards white men. If you Google the list of non-white directors to win Best Director at the Oscars, it is pitifully small. So I think there have been 455 nominations for Best Director. Of that, only 5 of them were women, only 13 of them were people of colour. And from the 92 winners that we've had of the Best Director, this is in 2020 making this video, 1 woman has won the Best Director Oscar, Catherine Bigelow for The Hurt Locker, and only 2 of the winners have been people of colour, and one of those was this year, Bong Joon-ho for Parasite. So, the Auteur Theory and that canon, that pantheon that Wollen has set up might be one of the problems with, the institutional sexism and racism of Hollywood, perhaps. So, to summarise then, the Auteur Theory, Francois Truffaut said the best directors are the ones who put their soul up on screen and show their vulnerability and their fears and their anxiety. According to Andrew Sarris, in order to be an auteur, you had to be technically competent, have a distinguishable personality, and your films had to have interior meaning. In terms of criticisms, Pauline Kael in particular, she's the one who takes against Andrew Sarris, and she said that technical competence isn't always great because it makes for boring, bland filmmaking. Distinguishable personality isn't good either because it's just repeating yourself, and repeating yourself is not a good thing. You should develop. And lastly, interior meaning, that's stupid too, because why would it be a good thing for a director to be in conflict, to have tension between them and the source of material? It should be working together. Her other big thing, obviously, as well, is that film is a collaborative process. So the whole idea of one person having the greatest influence over a film is stupid, because you've got so many people who work on a film to kind of just pinpoint it on one director is to disregard the collaborative nature of filmmaking. That's what makes it so unique and so great compared to other types of creative endeavours. Okay, and final criticism is obviously that the whole Auteur Theory is just a bit of a white men's club. So that's this video for Auteur Theory. At some point in the future, I'm going to do another couple of videos where we apply Auteur Theory to Blade Runner and to Vertigo. Thanks very much. Bye.